For this panel, it's my pleasure to now introduce Judith Stroehle, who'll be leading this panel discussion with Bruno and Colin, who you've now met before. Judith is currently a postdoctoral researcher on the Mutuality in Business project here at the Business School. Welcome, Judith.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to see there's still so many of you here. It's been a long day. We've heard some amazing stories about what economics of mutuality is all about. And I really hope that we can use this last session to sort of reflect back on what we've heard today, bring in some ideas, and discuss a little bit more before we go and have a glass of wine. I actually think there's no better way than to end this day like this than discussing the topic that's on the agenda. How can the economics of mutuality contribute to building innovative modes of profit construction, and how can new ways of thinking about profit alter business behavior and allocation of resources within firms? Mutuality addresses the increased realization that the ability of an organization to create value for itself is inextricably linked to the value it creates for others. And the upcoming debate should address that. In many ways, how frictions between these two concepts of value creation can be addressed and can be reduced. We've heard a lot of talk about how can we go from short-term to long-term, how can we go from exclusion to inclusion, how can we go from sustainability management to sustainable management. And we do want to address that a little bit more today. Unfortunately, Robert Eccles, a professor former Harvard business professor and now here at Saïd, couldn't join us. He is sick and couldn't make the travel over the pond. But we will take a little bit more time for Q&A instead. So I really hope that you all sort of sharpen your minds and get with us on the topic. So now I will ask both Bruno and Colin to just give a 5-minute statement about what they think about the topic. Then we'll kick off a couple of questions and take it from there. Bruno.
No, Colin.
Oh, Colin.
Okay. Judith, thank you very much for that introduction. And indeed, it is a great pity that Bob Eccles is not with us today. He is actually quite ill in the US and couldn't fly here. But as you say, it will give us some time to discuss what I think is probably the central question about the relationship of what we're talking about in relation to mutuality and the notions of profits of business. And let's come back to the observation that we made earlier today, that the central issue that needs to be thought about in terms of repositioning firms to be more mutual is how their purpose can be directed towards producing profitable solutions to the problems of people and the planet. And how do we avoid firms profiting from producing problems for people and the planet? And once you think about the purpose of business in those terms, it has some really quite profound implications, I think, not least in terms of how we conceive of profits of business. And I'm going to emphasize two aspects. The first is to think in terms of companies that are trying to promote solutions to the problems of people and planet as investing in those people and the planet. And the reason why it's appropriate to think about that as an investment in people and planet is because of the reciprocity that it creates. That by investing, the firm is committing to the interests of people and to the future of the planet in a way in which there will be a mutual reciprocal benefit to the firm. And it invests in activities where it perceives there as being that mutual benefit by so doing. Now that's important because it has significant implications for what we mean by profit. First of all, it means that to the extent that companies are investing in people and planet, they are incurring an expenditure that, like any other investment, should be regarded as an expenditure that's incurred over the life of that investment. So to the extent that, for example, a company invests in employees by training and educating them, and anticipates a benefit that they will derive from so doing, then we should regard that not as a current expenditure, but as an investment. And that's important when one thinks about trying to incentivize companies to promote the interests of people and planet. And the second aspect that it implies is that in terms of thinking about profit, that if companies do not sustain their investment in people and planet, if they fail to maintain those human, natural, and social capitals, then their profits should thereby be diminished correspondingly. So that where companies apparently profit at the expense of us as employees or as society or as suppliers, then that should be reflected in a cost that the company bears. Now, those two aspects potentially can transform the way in which we think about how to motivate companies to promote the interests of people and planet. And I just want to illustrate that in relation to what I talked about for those of you in the masterclass this morning, the balance sheet of companies as traditionally viewed in terms of financial assets and material assets, and creating shareholder net worth on the basis of those assets, to this notion that companies are actually also investing in their people and in their natural assets and in social capital that create other forms of assets which should be recognized as well, and thereby to create a mutual notion of the net worth of a company. And coming back to what I was saying at the beginning of this afternoon in terms of the observation about that massive increase in the apparent value of intangibles of the S&P 500 companies, which is measured by looking at the difference between the market value of those companies and their book value. One explanation for that is it's simply an accounting mistake. It's a failure to account for substantial components of companies' balance sheets that are associated with intangible assets and intangible investments in human, natural, and social assets. But this then has significant implications for thinking about what is profit. Because again, here is the conventional view of profit as being the difference between revenue and operating costs and depreciation of material assets to derive profits. But if we think about this notion that companies need to sustain those other forms of capital as well, if they're to uphold their commitments to those other parties, then we also have to take account of the costs associated with maintaining those assets, or to include a depreciation charge or a maintenance charge before we arrive at profit. And I just briefly want to illustrate how we can think about this in relation to the two issues that we had keynote addresses on today. First of all, from Kathy Willis in relation to natural capital. And the point she was emphasizing was that we should recognize natural capital assets as inputs into the production process of benefits for mankind and benefits for companies. And that in that regard, it is important to recognize when companies invest in their natural assets, they are investing in something that's equivalent to investing in their material assets. And if they fail to maintain the quality of their natural assets, then their profits should be correspondingly diminished. Now, you might say, well, you understand how one can get reciprocal benefits from investing in one's employees or in society. But how does one get a reciprocal benefit from a kangaroo or a koala bear? Well, the important element about natural capital is the remarkable feature of natural assets as being infinitely lived. They're one of the few assets in the world that, provided we don't overconsume them, regenerate themselves, so that they provide an ongoing service in perpetuity. Now, that's not a bad investment to get a return in perpetuity. So the notion as to how it's reciprocal comes from the remarkable return that one gets from sustaining those natural assets. And I'd just like to pick up the debate that Halvarian brilliantly led this afternoon in terms of the impact of new technologies on the future of work, in which he correctly said that, in particular with shrinking labor forces, ability of people to work, willingness of people to work, that machines have a vital role to play in supplementing those diminishing inputs from the labor supply. But it also raised a fundamental question in terms of who is going to reskill the workforce that are affected by those developments. And there are three possibilities. It's the individuals themselves who will have to invest in their own training and skills over their lifetime. Or it's the government that will take it on as the role of state to provide those educational skills. Or it's the role of business. And one of the elements in terms of thinking about that notion of reciprocity is, to what extent will companies that, in essence, provide an element of insurance to their employees through providing the necessary skills and retraining when these technological shocks occur, to what extent can they reap reciprocal benefits from so doing by having more committed workforces? And we might think that in a world of flexible labor supplies and mobility of labor, it's very difficult for companies to do that. But actually there are mechanisms by which they can, in essence, benefit from so doing. And I'll just illustrate with the example of one of the most successful banks in the world is one that pays its employees no bonuses at all. Can you imagine that? A bank that pays employees no bonuses until they retire at the age of 60, when they get a handsome share in the profit pool of the business. Now, that's a way in which one can incentivize people to return the commitment that a company makes in them. So the point I'm making is that these issues that we've been addressing today about how do we protect our natural capital, how do we ensure that it's not just us as consumers, but us as in employees in the workforce who benefit from technological changes, have as a fundamental underlying question, what do we mean by profit?
Well, thank you, Colin. We talked about this morning about the business case. And the business case is that a company that invests in its environment, in its ecosystem, according to non-monetary indicators, actually performs better across the board. Better impact on people and planet, but also better financial performance. And we now have, after like several years of research, we have a lot of evidence that even the businesses that do it imperfectly, or that do it without knowing it, happen to perform better. So this is the business case, right? But how do you ensure that this business case is translated into the accounting case? And in the accounting case, you have, again, two solutions. Either you work on the external reporting, or you work on the management accounting, which is actually the internal side of management accounting. And in a very pragmatic way, when we had sufficient insights about the business case, we had a conversation with Colin and with a few people in the business, and we say how to bring it into life. Okay? And our proposal is that the most efficient way of bringing this good news for business into life is not to leave it on the periphery of business and not to leave it to the corporate affairs people. Is to bring it back into the core, the heart of the business, which is essentially where value is being monitored and value is being managed and where decisions are being taken. And this is where the idea of the mutual P&L came about. And if you think about what we mean by mutual profit, we have the financial profit, and this doesn't change at all. We want to keep the financial profit for the external reporting. It's not something we want to change. This stays the same. But as a business, we happen to either deplete capital or we happen to create capital. We happen to deplete social, human, natural capital because we are not doing a good job at doing this. But we also happen to create social and human capital. And even sometimes we even can create natural capital. And this is this element of creation and depletion that we want to bring into the management account for two reasons, for two purposes. The first one is to, first of all, to be true with ourselves, to understand what real value do we create or do we destroy. But also it's about aligning the organization with its purpose. And by purpose, we mean that, well, if the business is meant to do more than just profit maximization, how a business can address the pain point in its ecosystem. And what is the first thing we do in an economics of multi-project is that we start with a mapping of the ecosystem of the business in which we operate. And that ecosystem is extremely contextual. It's not the same for a pet care company or a chocolate company or for a car industry or for a retailer. It's not the same. And the next step is to identify the pain point that exists in that ecosystem. The third step is to say, well, how, as a business, am I capable of addressing this pain point? Do you have the capacity? Do you have the vision? Can I mobilize stakeholders to address it? So what is my, in a sense, almost my spiritual capacity to address it and my practical capacity to address it? And once we have this list of pain points, which actually is a strategic decision by the management to say, well, okay, as a business, I can see this pain point and this pain point, and I know that I have to address them if I want my business to prosper in the future. So in a sense, it is a choice of the type of externalities you want to internalize. And this is when the mutual P&L comes into the equation. And the mutual P&L is based on three very simple principles. The first one is that we are talking here of a single bottom line, not a triple bottom line. We are talking also of a system in which each capital is remunerated according to its own kind. And by this, we mean that we don't want to put a dollar value on social, human, and natural capital. It sounds a bit unusual, but it's extremely simple. It's about to say, well, you want to remunerate money with money, but you want to remunerate social capital with social capital. You want to remunerate natural capital with natural capital. If you pollute water, for instance, replace it with clean water. And if you can actually replace it with cleaner water, so that you can give water a positive interest rate. But the cost of cleaning water can be part of the P&L. So it's a way actually to bring the value into your P&L. If you happen to create a program, for instance, among slums, I'm thinking about a project we have at the moment in Kenya, and then we happen actually to be net provider, net creator, net generator of social capital. But this creation of social capital has a cost. But here, we are creating social capital. So in a sense, we are adding to the bottom line. So at the end, you have a mutual profit, which is a balance between what your business has destroyed and what your business has created. And depending on your strategy, it can either be higher than your financial profit, or it can be lower than your financial profit. And this line at the bottom, the new bottom line, the way we call it, is actually a very efficient tool to align your organization with its purpose and with its capacity to address a specific pain point in your ecosystem. But it's also a way to account for the true value that you create or destroy. And it's also a very efficient way to align the bonus, the incentives of your organization to deliver against that bottom line. And this is, in my view, the innovation that we bring to the debate now. And I'm very sorry that Bob is not here, because he could have said that in a much more eloquent way. But 10 years ago, we were asked the question about the right level of profit. And with this mutual profit definition, we are responding to this question. And that question is extremely contextual. It is not perfect, but the notion of financial profit is not perfect neither. So we're not shooting for perfection here. We are actually in a sense, it's a way to heal the relationship between business and people, and to heal the relationship between business and the planet. And the potential power of this is that we do not give this methodology in the hands of corporate affairs people or marketing people. We give it in the hand of the chief financial officer, which actually, in our view, is a place in which this kind of discussion should take place, because it is at this level that decisions are being taken. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We only have about 48 seconds to go. So I will take a question if there is one. Please, the microphone down there. 3-word answers.
Two questions. Okay. Does this work? Yes. My name is Michel de Kemeter from Brussels. Thank you for this event. I have 2 questions. One first question is for Colin, if I may. When you talk about this new balance sheet, which is enriched, why? It's a very simple question. Why would you internalize only the assets and not the liabilities? You know, a balance sheet has 2 sides: assets, human assets, social, societal assets, environmental assets, but the liabilities are already there. The human liabilities, that means people in long-term absenteeism, in burnout, people that were destroyed by their job or whatever, and the environmental liabilities, which is the climate debt, the environmental debt, it's already there. It has been provoked by the same companies that we're talking about. It's maybe a little bit a rough question, but a balance sheet should have two sides, and the liability side has been quantified, can be very well quantified in sterling or in dollars. This is the first question. The second question, maybe for Bruno, if I may. We are actually in this dynamics of economics of mutuality, kind of wanting to facilitate a mutation of corporations. Am I right? Okay. let's say, Horizon 225. We had a very good exposé this morning by Halvarian. My question is the following. For large corporations, there are, I think, 3 elements. I didn't hear maybe a lot about it. The first one is speed. Pace, it's 7 years. When you see the speed at which technology and this societal transition is going, it's so fast. Are large corporations not actually, don't they have a huge handicap in their rigidity of the structure against agile collaborations between stakeholders that can disrupt the business models of those large corporations? It's happening as we speak. So I would like to have your angle from large corporations, but also the second is the psychological side. The young generation, the Z generation, actually doesn't want to work for some companies anymore. So the psychological aspect of being part of the problem or part of the solution is, I think, a second dimension. And the third dimension is the risk. The risk of innovating and disrupting your own business model. So these 3 aspects would be interesting to have addressed.
It's a good question.
Okay.
You're testing about intellectual agility.
I mean, just very quickly on the first of those, that's exactly what I mean in terms of not reflecting a profit where a company fails to maintain its social or human capital. So if it's not overcoming the problems that you are just talking about, then that should be regarded as a failure of the company to invest where it should be investing to sustain those natural or those human and social forms of capital. They would depreciate, and therefore you'd be incurring a loss on your profit statement. And what this is about is creating balance sheets and profit and loss statements which reflect the investment that companies are making and failing to make, and recording their profits accordingly. Quickly, in relation to your point about large companies versus small companies, one of the elements that I think we're trying to bring out is the need for companies to think about intrapreneurship as well as entrepreneurship by small companies. And that the advantage that small companies have advantage of greater flexibility, less bureaucracy, etc. The great advantage of large companies is the resources they've got available to them. So there are potential ability, if they can innovate and engage in entrepreneurship to solving human and social and natural capital problems, is tremendous in a way in which it's often difficult for small companies to scale up. And that comes to your second point about the incentive of the current generation to work in such corporations. If those corporations were perceived to be solving the problems of people and planet profitably, not just pursuing profits, I think they would be much more attractive propositions for the graduating students of this university and around the world.
I just want to add one word before we are already over time. And I would like to refer to a piece of work that we are starting with Judith and Bob. Because actually setting up a new P&L is a technical thing. And in a sense, it's more like a presentation of the results of our business. But the most important thing is the impact it will have on behavior. And it is that aspect of the behavior that will actually is powerful on multiple dimensions. We don't have time to go through them. But the most important one is that actually it is, in a sense, the ultimate artifact of a company that actually is serious about aligning its management account with its purpose. And by doing this, we want to, actually we're just doing as we speak, we are setting up a mutual P&L in a unit of mass, and we are measuring the impact it will have on behavior. And it's an ethnographic study, but we expect actually that the change of these metrics, the change of this management account will have huge impact. And we know actually that culture is critically important in business. And eventually, culture can evolve over time. But culture is based on artifacts. And if you want to evolve the culture, you evolve the artifact. And I would like to build on what Shubin said this morning. Culture doesn't come out of nothing. It comes out of a reality which is rooted in artifact. And the management account, or the mutual P&L, we think, is an artifact of a company that wants to evolve its culture from a profit maximization to a mutual profit maximization.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much.